Welcome to Video Bread Machines. My name is Steve and I'm an avid bread baker. I've been baking bread for a number of years and teaching people how to bake bread. It's great fun. If you've been thinking about getting a bread baking machine, I'd highly recommend it. The machines have really come down in price. This machine, a name brand, pound-and-a-half loaf unit, went for over $200 10 years ago when the machines first came out. Today, we can get this machine for about $60 US if we watch for a sale, and that's a really good deal. A bread baking machine is a self-contained unit. It does it all. We put our ingredients in the machine, press the start button, and about 4 hours later, we have a loaf of bread. We can put our ingredients in the machine in the evening and set the machine so that when we wake up in the morning, we have fresh hot bread to go with our breakfast. That's really nice. Your bread baking machine will come with instructions. It will come with some simple recipes, maybe a recipe book, and there are plenty of recipe books available at your public library or at bookstores with recipes for bread baking machines. You find that the recipes are very specific about the amount of ingredients that they use, the amount of yeast, the amount of water, the amount of flour, and that's because in a bread baking machine, we're baking in a confined area. The machine comes with a pan, and the bread, the loaf, will take the shape and size of the pan. If we use too much of something, the bread might come over the top and make a mess. If we don't use enough, it might not fill the pan. The recipes are very specific. I found that there is so much more that we can do with a bread baking machine than make these little generic loaves. And that's what I'm going to be demonstrating in the video, some of the other things that we can do. I use my bread baking machine to do the work for me. The machine does the mixing, the machine does the kneading. I no longer have to do that by hand. I let my dough go through its first rising in the machine, then I pull the dough out, shape it the way I want, and bake in my oven. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll go right to our list of ingredients for our first project, which is a simple white bread. Topping our list is 1 tablespoon of active dry yeast. We'll be using 1.5 cups of water at 110 degrees, and we'll actually measure the temperature of the water with a candy thermometer. Very important. 2 tablespoons of sugar as our sweetener, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of oil, and between 4 and 5 cups of bread flour. In this recipe, we're using an active dry yeast. Active dry yeast has been around for years, and it's the yeast that we soak in warm water. Let's go ahead and get started. To start, we'll add our water at 110 degrees. We actually measured the temperature of the water with a candy thermometer. To that, we'll add our yeast, our tablespoon of active dry yeast. And I'll turn my machine on and add my yeast slowly and let the machine mix it in. I want each one of the granules of yeast to get wet. And that's it. Shut off our machine and let that just sit and soak for 7 minutes. The yeast is blooming, blossoming, growing. We're proofing the yeast. We're proving that the yeast is in fact active and that it will work for us in our bread baking process. Yeast is an organism. It's grown commercially in large vats, and then it's dehydrated. The water is removed and it goes into a dormant state like a seed. When we get it to bring it back to life, we have to rehydrate it. We have to add the water back. So we let the yeast sit and just soak in the water at a temperature of 110 degrees for 7 minutes. The yeast will actually come alive between 70 and 140 degrees, but up around 140 will kill it. Down around 70, it'll start to come alive, but too slowly. We're trying to time the release of the gas into the bread baking process. It's like our window of opportunity. Well, there's our salt, 1.5 teaspoons of salt. We'll add our 2 tablespoons of sugar. May as well turn on our machine and let this start mixing things up a bit. And our oil, and that's it, our 1 tablespoon of oil. we're ready to start adding our flour. Okay, we'll add 1 cup of flour, and I'm using a bread flour. A bread flour is a high protein, high gluten content flour. It's readily available today. You can get it in any grocery store. That's a bread flour versus an all-purpose flour. An all-purpose flour it measures out at 11 grams of protein per cup. A bread flour has 14 grams of protein per cup. It's this high protein or gluten content that gives us a bigger, fuller loaf in our bread baking. In fact, you can think of your dough as having millions of little air pockets. There's our 2nd cup of flour. Millions of little air pockets like balloons. And if you're using an all-purpose flour, your balloons are low-quality balloons. They'll stretch and stretch, and some of them, not being able to stretch further, will break. And if we're using a bread flour, our little balloons are like using surgical rubber or latex balloons, and they will stretch and stretch and give us a bigger, fuller loaf. By about 20 to 30%, it really makes a difference. So always use a bread flour in your bread baking. Okay, we have 2 cups of flour in, and we'll go ahead and add our 3rd cup of flour. And see, the machine is doing all the work. We're not doing anything. You know, the machine is doing the mixing, the machine is doing the kneading. Sometimes what I do is I take an implement. I'll take a little cake frosting implement and help my machine along a bit, just sort of wet things, mix things in a bit, and that's fine. We've got 3 of our 4 to 5 cups of flour in our batch. And basically, I say 3 to 4 cups of flour because the amount of flour, since we're not cooking in the confined area of the bread baking machine, we're going to be baking in an oven. Put our dough in a bread pan and bake in our oven. We don't need to be really specific about the amount of ingredients we use. Some flours are moister than others. Sometimes flour will have a high moisture content, sometimes it won't. Different flours in different parts of the country and the world have different qualities and different moisture contents. What we're going to be doing is we're going to add just enough flour, and the dough will tell us how much flour it needs, and it'll tell us by how sticky it is. A dough, if it's wet, it tells us that it needs more flour. If it's dry, if it's hard and dry, it has too much flour. Now we have 3 cups of flour in this batch, and we can see that it's still wet. It needs more flour. And I'll go ahead and add another 1/2 cup of flour. And I'll use my implement again to help this along. It seems to be going nicely. Everything looks good. And it just looks wet. You can just see, just looking at the dough, you can see that it's wet. It has a shiny, glazy look. I'll add the rest of my flour. That's 4 cups of flour. That's probably enough. But what I'm going to do in the process, every once in a while, right now I can see it needs more flour. But what I'll do is I'll just feel it with my fingers, and right now that feels really good. It feels soft and a little tacky, but not sticky. If it's wet and sticky, it needs a little more flour. But 4 cups is about right for this batch, and maybe I'll add a little more. Like I say, we want the dough to be soft versus hard. We want it to be soft. We want it to be a little tacky, but not sticky. And like I say, what I'll do every once in a while is just feel it. And that's great. We're just going to let the machine go to town. I buy my yeast in quantity. This is a 2-pound package of yeast, which I find in a membership store, stores that sell to businesses and the public. It's a really good deal. You'll find yeast in the grocery store in small 1/4 ounce packets, usually come in a set of 3. One of these little packets goes for about 40 cents, $1.20 for 3. 40 cents for a small packet. The same amount in quantity is 3 cents. This is the only way to go. Keeps for a good long time. I seal the top with a potato chip clothespin. Keep it in the inside door of my refrigerator. It'll keep even longer in the freezer. Feels really good, really good. It's soft and a little tacky, but not sticky. It's just right. You can see that the dough ball spinning around inside the container has cleaned all the flour off the sides, and it's just great. It's just about ready to stop. This machine cycle goes for about 25 minutes, and it's at about the end of the cycle. And that's it. Now we're going to go ahead and let the dough go through its first rising in the machine. This is neat. This is some time-lapse photography of the dough rising. It's pretty neat. This is our first rising, and I'm taking one shot, 1 second, about every 60 seconds. It's just fun, just a neat thing to see. Now, yeast. Yeast is the key to bread baking. Usually, if you're having problems with your bread baking, it's in the yeast. It's a misunderstanding about the yeast. One thing I need to point out is that in my recipes I'm calling for a tablespoon of yeast. A tablespoon of yeast does not equal a packet of yeast. A packet of yeast used to be a tablespoon years ago, about 20 years ago, but no longer. In fact, today a packet of yeast is 2 teaspoons of yeast. So if we're using packets of yeast, that's fine, but 1 tablespoon equals 1.5 packets of yeast. Good thing to know. Remember, 1 tablespoon of yeast equals 1.5 packets of yeast. It's all ready. That took about 40 minutes. I'll just take my dough, pull it out of my pan, and it's a little hook on the bottom. I'm now done with my bread baking machine. I'll set that aside. My dough's all ready, and I'll grease a pan. Put a little oil in a pan, spread that around a bit, and take my dough and roll my dough out a bit. Like a rolling pin, just roll it long, and that's fine. Okay, I'm just trying to get the air out of the dough. I'll roll that up, rolling it tightly. Real simple process, and that's it. Put it in my bread pan. I'll cover the top with a little oil because I don't want the top to get dried out. And that's it. And we'll go ahead and let this just rise now until it gets really big, probably about an hour. The rising time depends on temperature. Temperature is an element. If it's a warm day, it will rise much more quickly than it will on a cool day. If you're up in Canada in the middle of the winter and your kitchen is cool, it might take an hour and a half to rise. I'm in Las Vegas, this is a hot day, and this will take about an hour. Now in the bread baking machine, it's different for our first rising, because in the bread baking machine, during the rising, the machine turns on. The heating element in the bottom turns on and makes it a nice warm environment, a consistent warm environment for the first rising. So that should take about 40 minutes, period, and should come right to the top of the pan. Let's go. We'll let this go for its second rising. Again, we have some time-lapse photography. I'm taking my 1 shot or 1 second about every 60 seconds, and it's neat to watch. We're watching the second rising, the rising in the bread pan, and there's an optimum time to pop the loaf in the oven. Now the loaf will rise on a warm day. It will rise faster than on a cool day. In a warm area, it will rise faster than in a cool area, but regardless of hot or cold, there's an optimum time to put the loaf in the oven. And we can see it rising. It's rising bigger, 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 bigger. At some point, it'll be overrisen and start to flop over the sides pretty much. We want to pop it in the oven on the upswing. We want to pop it in the oven when it's rising up before it gets too big. If we catch it just right, we'll get what's called oven spring or oven shoot. And in that, while we're in the oven, the dough will actually shoot up a little more. It'll rise another inch in the pan. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for this oven shoot or oven spring, it's called. It's pretty neat and a lot of fun. I'm going to place my loaf in the center of my preheated oven. And that's preheated to 375 degrees, and I'm going to go ahead and bake for about 30 minutes. I'll set my timer. That's it. Time, the moment of truth. Here we go, our first loaf. Oh, it looks great. Beautiful loaf. And I immediately remove my loaf from the pan and cool the bread on a rack. And this is the other rack from my oven. This is great. It's a beautiful loaf. Kids love white bread. This is nutritious also because it's an unbleached flour. Our bread flour is an unbleached flour. That's really, it's delicious and nutritious. Give it a try. That's a really good looking loaf of bread. Homemade, and you made it yourself. It's just great. Enjoy. In this segment of the video, we're going to make a stone ground whole wheat bread, and we'll be using the other type of yeast that's available, which is an instant yeast, also known as a quick yeast or a direct yeast or a bread baking machine yeast. In the first segment of our video, when we made our white bread, we used active dry yeast. Now that's been around since World War II, and it's the yeast that we soak. We let the yeast sit and soak in the water. The temperature of the water was 110 degrees. We let it soak for 7 minutes. This newer yeast that's been around for about 10 years, we don't soak. We mix with the dry ingredients, and I'm going to demonstrate that in this segment of the video. It's generally what's used today in bread baking machines. It comes in a 1-pound package, and it's readily available. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll go right to our list of ingredients for our stone ground whole wheat bread. Topping our list is 1 tablespoon of yeast, and we're using our instant yeast. 1½ cups of water, and just warm. We don't need to measure the temperature of the water this time. We'll be using 2 tablespoons of honey as our sweetener, 1½ teaspoons of salt, 1 tablespoon of oil, 1 3/4 cups of whole wheat flour, and I'm using a stone ground flour because I can get it. I always use a stone ground flour when I can get it. And we'll be using between 2 1/4 and 3 cups of bread flour. Let's make some bread. Let's get started, and first we'll add our water. And that's 1½ cups of water. Just warm. We didn't bother measuring the temperature of the water this time. I'll add my sweetener, my honey, 2 tablespoons of honey. Go ahead and turn on my machine. I'll add my oil, my tablespoon of oil, and my salt. And that's it. Okay, now I'll let that mix for a bit and go ahead and add 1 of my cups of flour. I'll add 1 cup of bread flour. Now, as a rule, I add my yeast after adding 1 cup of flour. I'm using about 4 cups of flour in each of these recipes. I'll let my first cup mix up a bit and then go ahead and add my yeast. And I'll get my yeast ready. Here we go. There's my 1 tablespoon of my instant yeast. Now, the way this yeast works, as soon as the yeast and the water mix, the process starts. So that's it. In fact, that's how a bread baking machine works. We can put our liquid ingredients in the machine first, then put in our flour, put the yeast on the top, set a timer, and the thing will go off in the morning and start working for us. As soon as the machine turns on, the yeast then mixes with the water and the process starts. Okay, so there's 2 of our cups of flour. That's our second cup. That's another cup of bread flour. Next I'll start adding my whole wheat flour. I'll let that just mix a bit. And my wheat flour is a stone ground whole wheat flour. I always use a stone ground flour whenever I can get it. It's more nutritious. In fact, when flour is ground in commercial mills, the grinding wheels are steel wheels, and they go like 24 hours. They heat up, and in the process of grinding, some of the nutritional value is baked off of the flour with these hot grinding wheels. And the stone ground wheels, we don't have that. In fact, it's more nutritious. And okay, there's my third cup of flour. That's one of my 1 3/4 cups of stone ground whole wheat flour. And the reason in this recipe, all my recipes are calling for about 4 cups of flour. And I always say between 4 and 5, 4+ cups of flour. And that's because different flours have different moisture contents and in different parts of the world. Some flours are drier than others in different parts of the country and in different parts of the world. As an example, in Canada has a really, really good bread flour, really high protein, high gluten content flour, and it's therefore a drier flour and requires proportionately more water in recipe. That's why bread recipes in Canada for bread baking machines will be different than the recipes found in the United States. They'll be using proportionately more water in their recipes because the flour is drier. When we add flour to our recipes, no matter where you are, you can be any place in the world, we don't need to be specific about the amount of flour we're using because we're not going to be baking in the confined area of a bread baking machine. We're going to be adding our flour as required. Our dough will tell us whether we're making it in a machine or by hand. Our dough will tell us how much flour is required. And you'll learn this once you've been working with the bread baking machines or just making bread for a while. You'll learn, and basically you can tell just by the look and the feel of the dough. If the dough is wet, if the dough looks or feels wet, it's telling you that it needs more flour. We want our dough to be soft and tacky but not sticky and wet or wet. If our dough is hard, we've added too much flour. We don't have enough water. We can still save it by adding a little more water really at any point in the process. But when our dough is wet, it's telling us that it needs more flour. Ideally, we want our dough to be soft and a little tacky, but not sticky. Okay, we can see looking at this dough that it just looks wet. You can just look at it and see that it's wet. You can feel it, and it's just wet and sticky. And sure enough, we don't have all of our flour in here yet. We'll go ahead and add the rest of our stone ground whole wheat flour. We now have about 3 3/4 cups of flour. And the machine, you can see it stop every once in a while. It'll stop and change directions. This whole process in the machine, the mixing and kneading, will take about 25 minutes. And then the rising in the machine will go for about 40 minutes. Okay, that looks nice. We can see how wet it looks. I mean, it's telling us that it needs more flour. So I'll add the rest of my bread flour. I now have about 4 cups of flour in the batch. Now, one nice thing about these machines, and the reason we're able to use this yeast, is that heat is a catalyst in the bread baking process. We need heat. The heat activates the yeast. And the machines have a heating element under the pan. It's like a broiler element in an electric oven. It turns on at this point the heating element is on. It's producing heat. It's making a nice warm environment. It's warming our batch. In fact, if you put your ingredients in the bread baking machine at night, the water would be cold. It would end up being cold water. If you put your water, your salt, your oil, and your sugar in the bottom of the machine, and then put in your flour, and then put your yeast on the top, which is what you would do in a bread baking machine, and let it sit and go off in the middle of the night, the water would be cold. Something needs to activate the yeast. We need this heat. So the element and the bottom of the machine turns on and gives us the heat that we need. That's really important. Okay, every once in a while I'll just feel my dough. This feels really good. That's it. It has all the flour. It's soft and tacky, but not sticky. We're going to go ahead and let the machine complete the kneading cycle. That will take about 25 minutes, and we'll come back at the end of the first rising. And that's it. That's it for the first rising. That took about 40 minutes. I let my dough double in size and then immediately take it out and work with it, shape it for my second rising. I don't want my first rising to go too long because I want the activity of the yeast. I want the rest of the life of the yeast to work for me in my second rising, and then have some left even for my baking to get some oven shoot or oven spring. So I don't let my first rising go too long. Double in size, that's enough. Remove the dough from the pan and just pull it out. That's it. We're done with our bread baking machine. And this time I'm not going to bother rolling out the dough. I don't need to. I'll just take my dough and knead it briefly to get the air out. And just make it into a ball, pretty much, and that's it. It's set to go. A ball of dough. I'll grease my pan, oil my pan. I don't want the bread to stick in the bread pan, so spread a little oil around my pan, that's fine. Put my dough in, real easy. Cover the top a bit, I don't want the skin to dry out. And I'll make my slits, 3 slits, cosmetic slits in the top of the bread. Sharp knife or razor blade is great. And we'll let this go through its second rising. This will take about an hour. Again, we have some time-lapse photography of our second rising. I'm taking my one shot, 1 second, about every 60 seconds. And this yeast, the instant yeast, or the quick yeast as it's known, is the same as the active dry yeast. A packet does not equal a tablespoon. My recipes call for a tablespoon of yeast. If you're using the packets of yeast, again, you'll need to use a packet and a half. In fact, 1 packet equals 2 teaspoons of yeast. And that's just the way it is. So 1 tablespoon equals a packet and a half of yeast. Also, again, we're waiting for the optimum time to pop the loaf in the oven. This will take about an hour under my conditions with the heat that I have in my environment. But we want our loaf not to over-rise. We don't want it to rise too much. We don't want the dough to come flopping over the sides. If it does, we can always punch it down, start the process over, and let it rise again. But we're really trying to catch the optimum time to pop it in the oven and get this oven spring or oven shoot. That's ideally what we're looking for. Into the oven. Preheated, 375 degrees. I'll place my loaf and go ahead and let that bake for my 30 minutes. And that's it. Set my timer. Now, what I'm going to be doing is after 20 minutes, I'll place a tinfoil shield over my loaf. The reason for this, sometimes you'll find that your loaves are cooking, the top looks done, the top will even start to burn, but the bottom's not done. In that case, we'll use a tinfoil shield. If you need to. A lot of times you will need to in an electric oven, you won't need to in a gas oven. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to spray my loaf with a spray bottle, just water. I'll just open my oven and spray a few times, about every 5 minutes. It's a way of treating the crust. There's many ways that we can treat the crust. This will make my crust a little crisper and a little shinier. Just a nice trick. It's time. Oh, it looks good. Take it right out of my pan. And really nice looking loaf. Beautiful loaf. Stone ground whole wheat bread. Delicious. Give it a try. Just another beautiful loaf. And delicious. Made it yourself. Enjoy. In this segment of the video, we're going to make a rye bread. This is my favorite bread. It's a caraway rye bread with dill and garlic. It's delicious. We'll be using dark molasses for our sweetener. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll go right to our list of ingredients for our rye bread. Topping our list, we have 1½ cups of warm water, 2 tablespoons of molasses, 1½ teaspoons of salt, 1 tablespoon of oil, 1 tablespoon of instant yeast, about 3 or 3+ cups of bread flour, 3/4 cup of rye flour, 1/2 cup of whole wheat flour, 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, 1/2 teaspoon of whole dill weed, and 2 tablespoons of caraway seeds. In this recipe, I'm using a dark molasses. You can get a dark molasses or a light molasses, and the dark molasses is what's going to give the bread its color. The darker the molasses, the darker the bread. Another thing that's interesting is the rye flour, the amount of rye flour that we're using. Very little rye flour. Commercial bakers are only using about 15% rye flour in a rye bread. In fact, to give you that really rye taste, what they're doing is they'll add ground caraway. We're going to be using 2 tablespoons of caraway in our loaf. We could add more, but you can only put so many seeds in a loaf of bread. And if you want more caraway flavor, you can get ground caraway. The rye flour has a low gluten content. It's this glue that makes our air pockets, our balloons, and that's why we're using so little of it. We're using proportionately a very small amount of rye flour, some stone ground whole wheat flour. The majority of our flour is a bread flour. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll add our water. And that's 1½ cups of warm water. Go ahead and turn on our machine. We'll add our molasses, our sweetener. And that's our 2 tablespoons of molasses, our salt, our 1½ teaspoons of salt, and our 1 tablespoon of oil. That's it. Ready to start adding our flour. I'll go ahead and add 1 cup of flour. There's a cup of my bread flour. And remember our rule, we'll add our yeast after we have 1 cup of flour in the machine. Let that mix up just a bit. The machine starts out by just mixing. Right now it's doing some mixing, and all of a sudden it'll start really mixing vigorously. That's when it really goes into its kneading cycle. And that's mixing nicely. We'll go ahead and add our tablespoon of instant yeast. There it goes. Let that mix in now nicely. And that's it. And there is some logic to the order in which we're adding our ingredients. I put my oil, my salt, and my molasses in first, in with my water, my liquids. If I was using sugar, I would have put that in. You know, I would want sugar or salt to melt or dissolve, and that's why I put those ingredients in first. Anything that we want to dissolve, we'll put in first, in with the liquids. In this recipe, our caraway seeds, our dill, and our garlic is not going to dissolve, so we can put that in with our dry ingredients. That's good. And I'll put in my 2nd cup of flour. There's another cup of bread flour, and that's looking pretty good. I'll go ahead and help that along, mix it a bit. We're trying to mix the yeast thoroughly, get the full use out of our yeast, deploy each one of the little granules. We want it mixed as evenly and completely as we can through the batch. That's why we put our yeast in early. And let that go a bit. We're ready to start adding our stone ground whole wheat flour. At this point, we'll go ahead and add the rest of our dry ingredients. We'll add our garlic powder. There's our 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder. And we'll add our 1/2 teaspoon of dill. We're going to add these ingredients at some point where they can mix in well. And our 2 tablespoons of caraway seeds. Let that mix in a bit. We're ready to start adding the rest of our flour. Go ahead and add my stone ground whole wheat flour, and I'll add my rye flour and the rest of my flour off camera. We'll let the machine go ahead and complete the mixing and the kneading, and we'll come back at the end of the first rising. Again, that's it for the first rising. About 40 minutes. It came to almost the top of the pan, then I stopped, pull it out, go on to our next step. I'll remove my dough from the machine, punch it down, and that's good. Done with my machine, that's it. I'll go ahead and grease a pan, just put some oil in the pan, and mix that around a bit. Don't want my bread to stick to the pan. Knead this briefly. Not bothering again with a rolling pin, and this is just fine. That's it. Make it into a ball. I'll go ahead and put that into my pan. Cover the skin with a little oil so that it doesn't dry out. Make my 3 traditional slits. Great. Let's go to our second rising. We'll place our loaf in our preheated oven, 375 degrees, and that will be for 30 minutes. It's time. I'll remove my loaf from the oven. Another beautiful loaf. Done perfectly, bottom is done perfectly. Beautiful loaf, beautiful loaf. I love rye bread. Try it at home. This rye bread is really delicious with Swiss cheese and mustard, ham. Really good bread, my favorite. Enjoy. In this segment of the video, we're going to be making honey buns. I love honey buns. They're delicious, great for breakfast with coffee, and easy to make. We'll be using our bread baking machine, and I'm going to use the active dry yeast. That's the yeast that you soak, and I prefer using the active dry yeast. It's half the price also. A 2-pound bag of active dry yeast is the same price as a 1-pound bag of the newer quick or instant yeast. You can use either type, but I prefer the active dry yeast. Another thing that's good to buy in quantity is honey. For some reason today, honey is really expensive. I'll buy my honey in quantity and also my nuts. I buy nuts in quantity. What I don't use, I freeze. They keep well. It's great. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll go right to our list of ingredients for our honey buns. Topping my list is 1½ tablespoons of yeast, and you can use either type, the instant or the active dry yeast. I'm using the active dry yeast, and 1¼ cups of water. I'll be measuring the temperature of my water because I'm using the active dry yeast. 1½ tablespoons of honey, 1½ teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of margarine, 1 egg, and about 4+ cups of flour. Then for my filling, I'll be using 1/4 cup of sugar and 1½ teaspoons of cinnamon. Then my syrup, what I'm calling a syrup, will be a 50-50 honey margarine mixture. I'm using 1 cup of honey and 1 cup of margarine. That's what makes these honey buns. And a cup of nuts, and I'll be using some really nice whole pecans. I made my dough off camera. We're through with the first rising. I soaked my yeast in warm water, 110 degrees. I added my margarine. I added my salt. I added my honey. I let that mix up a bit, and then I added my flour. Let the machine do the mixing and kneading, and here we are at the end of the first rising. I'll go ahead and punch down my dough, remove it from my pan, and we are done with our machine. Set this aside. And that's it. Now I have my dough, and what I'm going to do is roll my dough out into a rectangle. Really simple. Just take my dough and take a rolling pin, and we'll roll this out. Okay, I'll pick it up a bit, maybe stretch it a little, and just roll this out into a rectangle. Really straightforward. All right. And there we go. That looks good. Just roll it into a rectangle, nothing complicated, and then I'll start adding the rest of my ingredients. I have my sugar and cinnamon mixture here. I'm going to spread this on the top in a minute. And that's good enough. That's it. Okay, we'll take our sugar and cinnamon mixture and just spread this on top of our dough. Really uncomplicated. And that's it. I'll spread that around a bit. Just that simple. Now we're going to roll up our dough. I'll roll this into a cylinder. And nothing complicated about it. Just roll this into a cylinder, trying to roll it tightly. Really uncomplicated, very straightforward. And this sugar cinnamon mixture will melt in the baking process and make a gooey syrup, which is delicious and part of the taste of the honey buns. And that's it. So here we go. There are my honey buns. I'm going to slice these, and I'll just cut them in half, and in half again, and half again. I'll make a total of 8 in this batch. Really straightforward. And that's all we're going to do. That's it. Now we'll take our pan. We don't need to grease our pan because we're going to be putting here is our 1 cup of margarine and our 1 cup of honey. I brought this to temperature in my microwave. It's melted basically. I'm just going to put this in the bottom of the pan. Make sure I get it all out, and that's our syrup basically. That's what I'm calling in the recipe a syrup. And that looks really good. I'll spread that around a bit. Make sure the honey and the margarine are mixed evenly, and just that simple. We're done. Now I'll go ahead and put my nuts in the bottom of the pan, spread them around, and I'll start putting in my honey buns. I'll move them around, I'll cover them completely with the syrup, and that is honey buns. We're going to let these go ahead and go for a rising, and I'll show you that, a first rising. Just wet them all a bit. We want them to be coated with the butter and the honey. And that's it. Those are our honey buns. And real simple, very straightforward. And I'll put some of the nuts on the honey buns. That's great. We have our time-lapse photography, and this is our second rising. Just neat to watch. The honey buns are one of my favorite things. We could just as easily be making sticky buns now. They're very similar. The difference would be that in the syrup, we'd be using a molasses instead of a honey. But it's just fun. It's neat to watch. Doesn't take long. When they get big, we'll just pop them in the oven, and it's just that simple. Nothing really complicated about this recipe. Really straightforward. That's it for the second rising, all set to go. Right into our preheated oven, again 375 degrees. That's it. And that will take about 25 minutes, but I'll take a look at 15 minutes, then again at 20. It's time. It was 25 minutes. Here we go. Out of the oven. Oh boy. They look great. And with these, a little trick, we're going to serve these upside down. So I'll put a pizza pan over the top and just do a quick flip motion. That's it. Real straightforward. Remove my pan, and there we have them. Oh boy. Well, if you've If you like this type of baking, I have another video called Early Bird Baking. In that I make sweet rolls, raisin bread, honey buns, sticky buns, banana nut muffins, chocolate muffins, bran muffins, blueberry muffins. I make coffee cake. Check that out. It's a lot of fun also. And that's it. This is like having dessert for breakfast. Look how soft these are. Just great. Don't those pecans just look delicious? Try it at home. In this segment of the video, we're going to make pizza. I love pizza. Everyone loves pizza. The large pizza outfits have made a fortune selling pizza in the last 20 years. There's no cost in a pizza. The most expensive ingredient is probably the cheese. We can make a pizza at home for next to nothing. Very little cost, fast, efficient, in our bread baking machine. Any way you want it. Thick crust or thin, zesty sauce, anything you want on it, extra cheese. Let's do it. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll go right to our list of ingredients for our pizza. Topping my list is 1 tablespoon of yeast. I can use the instant yeast or the active dry yeast, whatever I have. 1½ cups of water. 2 tablespoons of honey. Could use sugar. 1½ teaspoons of salt. 2 teaspoons of oil. 4+ cups of flour. That can be a bread flour or an all-purpose flour. And some pepper. I like pepper in my shell. Then my sauce is a 15-ounce can of tomato sauce, generic can of sauce, 1 tablespoon of Italian seasoning, 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, and some Tabasco. I like a zesty sauce, and I swear by Tabasco sauce. Let's make some pizza. I made my dough off camera. We're done with our machine. Okay, set that aside, and I'll take my dough, pull it out of the machine, and that's all set. Done with my machine. Now, this is actually enough dough for 2 pizzas. I always make extra dough. So I'll go ahead and just cut this in half and set half of the dough aside. We're going to take our pan. I have a dark dish pan. We can use any pan, but I found that a dark dish pan works best. We could use a regular pizza pan, but if you can find a dark dish, this is a deep dish, dark coated pan, it's well worth it. Really makes a difference. Okay, here we go. Now we're going to get our dough, just put some oil on our dough and start hand stretching our dough. We don't even need to go through a kneading or a mixing. The machine does the mixing and the kneading, but we don't need to go through a rising. As soon as the machine is done with the mixing and kneading, we can pull the dough out and immediately start spreading it out on our pans. But it is best to allow the dough to sit, maybe go through at least 5 minutes of the rising. After the dough has been kneading, it's stiff, and it takes a few minutes to relax. It's easier to work with if your dough is relaxed. See, I'm now hand stretching my dough. Really straightforward. And I'm just going to literally just push this out on the pans. Really straightforward. In fact, I went to a pizza expo, a convention for the pizza industry here in Las Vegas, and I saw the different machinery that the pizza shops were using, and I saw that in a high volume pizza shop, a place that sells a lot of pizzas, they have a dough press. They take a ball of dough, put it under a press, the machine comes down and presses it into a big flat pizza shell. And that's all we're doing. We're taking our dough and just stretching it. Taking a ball of dough and stretching it out on the pan. It's just that simple. Okay, and see how fast that was? Really straightforward. That's it. That's all there is to a pizza shell. Now my sauce, again, I made my sauce off camera, and that was simply a can of generic tomato sauce, just sauce, not an Italian seasoning, or not a spaghetti sauce. Then I used a tablespoon of Italian seasoning, which I buy in quantity. I used some garlic powder, And I put Tabasco in everything. I like Tabasco. Tabasco has a zesty flavor that I like in my pizza sauce. It's a matter of taste. And I'm going to put my sauce on my shell, really straightforward. And I'll just spread out my sauce. And that's it. That's 1 can of sauce. Now I'll put on my cheese. And I buy blocks of cheese. I buy a 5-pound block, usually cut it into 5 pieces, which is 1-pound chunks. And then I'll slice the pieces like I'm doing here. I just slice them and set that on top of my pizza. Really straightforward, and that's it. And I'll put on my pepperoni. I'm just making a cheese and pepperoni pizza, really straightforward. And look how fast this is. Really simple. Now there's no cleanup in our machine. I have a preheated oven also. When I start a pizza, I preheat my oven. A hot oven is really important. In fact, I'm using an oven at 475 degrees. That's really hot. What I'll do is I'll put my pizza in and check it after about 15 minutes and watch it every 5 minutes thereafter. I keep lifting up the crust. I'll take a fork and look at the bottom to see if the bottom is done. When the bottom is done, that's it. If it looks like the top, just like with bread, if it looks like the top is cooked, starting to brown, even starting to look burnt, but the crust isn't done, the bottom isn't done, then just like with bread, I'm prepared to put on my tinfoil shield to stop the top from cooking while the bottom remains cooking. Another trick, a lot of times you may have to do in an electric oven, is lower the pizza. Put the pizza lower in the oven, closer to the heat, the heating element. That will help also. That's it, really fast. A pizza. We'll just pop it in our preheated oven. Remember, 475 degrees. And I'll set my timer, set this for 25 minutes, but we might burn it if we left it in there for the full 25 minutes. I'll look at it after 15 and check it every 5 minutes thereafter. Time. Let's remove our pizza from the oven. Beautiful pizza. Nothing better than fresh homemade pizza. It's hot. If you have pizza delivered, it won't be this hot. This is great. Some of the issues with pizza, it's really easy, but put enough grease, put enough oil on the bottom of your pan so that the shell won't stick. When you're done pushing your dough out on the pan, you can remove the dough and sprinkle some cornmeal on the pan, then put your dough back on. You know, when I made my sauce, I simmered my sauce on the stove. I used to just pour the tomato sauce right out of the can on top of the pizza, on top of the shell, and then sprinkle on my dried Italian seasoning. I didn't simmer it at all, and you know, that works just fine. We can put anything we want on it, just great. You can go around the edge and put on sesame seeds. You can put cheese in the lip of your crust. Any ingredients you want on it. Cheese, you can buy the bags of cheese. It's faster. The shredded cheese comes in a 5-pound bag. Pizzas are great. It's a great cost savings too. It's fun, good family fun also. Now, doesn't that look good? Made it yourself? Try it at home. Really great looking crust. Enjoy. In this segment of the video, we're going to be making hearty loaves of bread, hearty and healthy. A hearty loaf of bread is a heavier loaf of bread. In fact, in Europe, the breads are heavier than what we have here in the United States. I'm going to be showing you how to make that. Also, healthy breads. We can make our bread healthy by fortifying it, by adding any one of a number of things that we can get in a grocery store or a health food store or a bake shop. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll go right to our list of ingredients for our first bread, which is a honey nut rye bread. Topping my list is 1 tablespoon of yeast. Now that can be the active dry yeast that I soak in warm water at 110 degrees for 7 minutes, or the quick yeast or the instant yeast that I add after I've added my 1 cup of flour. Okay, then I'm using 1½ cups of water, 2 tablespoons of honey as my sweetener, 1½ teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of oil, 1 cup of bread flour. After I add my bread flour, I'll go ahead and add my gluten, my 2 tablespoons of gluten. I'm using 2 cups of rye flour, that's a lot of rye, 1 cup of whole wheat flour, and a ½ cup of chopped nuts, and I'm using some chopped pecans in this loaf. This is an example of what a difference gluten makes. This loaf has 2 tablespoons of gluten. This loaf does not. Look at the size difference. Same everything, same taste. Nothing's wrong with the smaller loaf. They both taste the same. They're both really nice loaves of bread. By adding gluten, I can make a bigger, fuller loaf if I want to. We can buy gluten. Here's a 27-ounce container of gluten. If you want a bigger, fuller loaf, you can add gluten to your bread. Nothing wrong with this loaf, but if we want a bigger loaf, we can add gluten. Okay. Now I'm going to make, I'll show you a bigger, fuller loaf. Here's a big, full loaf. This is a 7-grain loaf. I bought in the grocery store a bag of 7-grain cereal, and I'm using some of this in my loaf. It's great. It's coarse ground. Another thing we'll be talking about color, and when we use honey as a sweetener, we end up with a light bread. If we use a dark molasses, we'll have a darker bread. There's some other things we can do. One is coffee. One of these loaves that I'll show you uses instant coffee just for coloring, and it adds an interesting flavor also. Let's go to the list of ingredients for those 2 loaves, the 7-grain loaf and then the coffee rye. Topping my list is 1 tablespoon of yeast, and again that can be the active dry yeast or the quick yeast. 1½ cups of water. I'll be using molasses as my sweetener. 2 tablespoons of molasses, 1½ teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of oil, 2½ cups of bread flour, 1 cup of whole wheat flour, and 1 cup of my 7-grain mix, and it's stone ground, so it's a coarse grain. And I'll be using some gluten in this. I'll add a tablespoon of gluten just to demonstrate the big full loaf. For my coffee rye, I have my 1 tablespoon of yeast, 1½ cups of water, 2 tablespoons of molasses as my sweetener, and then 3 tablespoons of instant coffee. And that's for color really, and it adds a nice flavor, but I'm going to mix and dissolve this in with the liquids. Then again, my salt, my 1.5 tablespoons of salt, my oil, 1½ cups of bread flour, 1 cup of my whole wheat flour, a cup of rye flour, 1/3 cup of quick oats, and then some chopped nuts. I'll be using 1/3 cup of chopped pecans. Look at the color on these loaves. This is our honey nut that we made the first time. Honey is our sweetener, and it's the lightest. Here we have our 7-grain loaf, and we use molasses, and that was even a dark molasses. Look at the color. Now here's our coffee rye. Look how dark that is. That's our 3 tablespoons of instant coffee. Notice the colors. This is honey, even a dark molasses, and here we have the coffee. You can see also my 7-grain cereal is stone ground. It's very coarse, and that's what's going to give us some texture. It's just fun in the bread. If it was fine ground like a flour, we wouldn't know it was there. The nutritional value would be there, but we wouldn't see it or be able to chew it or taste it. This was my 7-grain bread, and I used gluten in it, got a big full loaf. It also had a lot of bread flour, so it's a big full loaf. We still ended up with a pretty good sized loaf with our coffee rye. We didn't have to use gluten. We still had enough bread flour. 2 really nice loaves. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to make some odd breads. I'm going to make a bread using coffee, just a cup and a half of coffee as my liquid, another bread using a cup and a half of dark beer, and I'll make another loaf using some unsweetened or baker's chocolate. Let's go ahead and go right to our list of ingredients. For my coffee nut mix, I'm starting with my tablespoon of yeast. I'm using 1½ cups of black coffee, just a cup of coffee, as my liquid. 2 tablespoons of molasses, 1½ teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of oil, 1½ cups of bread flour, 1 cup of whole wheat flour, 1 cup of rye flour, 1 cup of 7-grain mix, and 1/3 of a cup of chopped nuts. Now if we look at that, we'll see that this is going to be a heavy loaf also. We're not using gluten, and we only have 1.5 cups of bread flour. Then for our dark beer bread, we're going to be using 1 tablespoon of yeast, 1½ cups of dark beer flat. That means I let it sit for a couple hours or so, and that's 1 12-ounce bottle. 2 tablespoons of molasses as my sweetener, 1½ teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of oil, 2 cups of whole wheat flour, a tablespoon of gluten, 2 cups of rye flour, and 1/2 cup of 7-grain mix. Now, even though we've added some gluten, we have no bread flour. We have 2 cups of rye flour, and this is going to be another really heavy loaf. You can tell by reading the recipes how the loaf is going to turn out. It's how much bread flour is there and ultimately how much gluten is there. Then my chocolate onion mix, I'm using my tablespoon of yeast, 1½ cups of water, 1/2 ounce of unsweetened chocolate. That's your baker's chocolate, and I'll dissolve that. I'll go ahead and melt that in my microwave and mix it with my water. And then to that I'll add my 2 teaspoons of instant coffee to dissolve that also. I wouldn't want to mix that with the dry ingredients. There's my 2 tablespoons of molasses, 1½ teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of oil, 2 cups of bread flour, 2 cups of rye flour, 1/2 cup of 7-grain mix, 1/2 teaspoon of garlic powder, 1/2 teaspoon of onion powder, and 1/3 of a cup of chopped nuts. All the breads turned out nice. This is my coffee nut mix, really nice. This is my dark beer bread, heavy. These are all really heavy breads. And look at the color on the chocolate onion bread. By far the darkest. Now we've made a variety of hearty breads. We've made some heavy breads. Our beer bread was really heavy. That's a tiny little loaf compared to this one. Okay, this is a really heavy bread. And we've learned that the amount of gluten is really the issue. A bread flour is a high gluten, high protein content flour. In fact, look, it says so on the bag, high gluten flour. That is a 50-pound bag of bread flour. We can add gluten. So we can make a heavy loaf, a tiny little heavy loaf, or we can make it a bigger, fuller loaf if we want. But it's just a matter of choice. There's nothing wrong with a small loaf. These loaves are delicious. Now, to make our bread more nutritious, there's a variety of things we can do. We can add wheat germ, oat bran, wheat bran, any number of grains. Yesterday I went to the store and I went to the bulk area and bought a variety of bags of different things. This is oat bran, this is wheat bran. This was 38 cents a pound. Can't go wrong. In any one of my recipes I could add a tablespoon here, a tablespoon there of the oat bran, the wheat bran. Here's a couple different types of oats. Quick oats and rolled oats. Here's what's called a 6-grain mix. These are all inexpensive. Then I went to a baking shop and I got some buckwheat. I had them grind some buckwheat for me. And here's some millet. I had them grind some millet. Now this is one of the grains in a 7-grain bread. If we put this in, we could put some of this in also, but we wouldn't really know it was there. The nutritional value would be there, but it's ground like flour. We really wouldn't know it was there. We can use cornmeal. In fact, if I look at my bag of 7-grain cereal, wheat, oats, bran, rye, cornmeal, flaxseed, and millet. That's it. That's a 7-grain. Anything we want to add, we can add. Now our sweetener, we're using honey and molasses. And honey's very much better for you than, say, white sugar. Our salt has no function. It gives our bread the flavor, but if you want to cut down on the salt, you can. Our oil is a vegetable oil. I always use a vegetable oil. Stay away from animal fats. We could put eggs in our bread. We could put milk in our bread, skim milk or whole milk. I don't. I use water and I never put eggs in. I try and stay away from the animal fats. The bread is nutritious. A bread flour is an unbleached, high protein, high gluten content flour. Our stone ground flours are really good for us. Here's a 50-pound bag of stone ground whole wheat flour. Really good for you. Well, try it at home. Try some of these breads. They are delicious. Take a last look at some of these loaves. Aren't these some really good looking loaves? Try these at home. They are just great. Enjoy. In this segment of the video, we're going to shape our dough in a variety of ways. We'll be using different pans. Here's a nice pan that I use to make an Italian bread shape. Really nice. We'll be making buns and rolls, freeform loaves. Here's a braided loaf that's neat. And we'll treat the crust in a variety of ways. I'll paint it with things, put seeds on it, spray it with water in the oven, and we'll take a cast iron skillet and make steam in our oven while we're baking our bread, and it gives our crust a nice effect. Now the recipes we'll be using, one is a basic white bread, a basic white dough. The second and third are variations of white dough. The first I'm calling an Italian bread, the second a French bread. Let's go to our recipes. My first recipe is the basic white bread that we started the video with. I'm using a tablespoon of yeast, and that can be the active dry yeast, the yeast that you soak, or the yeast that you don't soak, the quick yeast or the instant yeast, the direct yeast. I'm using my 1½ cups of water, 2 tablespoons of sugar as my sweetener, 1½ teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of oil, and 4+ cups of bread flour. Should be about 4 cups total flour. Then my second recipe, I'm calling an Italian bread. It's the same thing, but I'm using an olive oil, and I've cut my sweetener in half. I'm using 1 tablespoon of sugar as my sweetener instead of 2. And then the French bread, same thing again, but no sweetener at all, no sugar at all, and no oil. And I'm splitting my flour here. I'm using 1 cup of bread flour, and the difference I'm using an all-purpose flour. French bread in France, they have the flour they use is a medium gluten content flour. It doesn't have the high gluten content that our bread flour does, so we mix it, say 3 cups of all-purpose flour to 1 cup of bread flour. To start, I have some dough, and take it out of my pan, and we'll make some French or Italian bread shapes. Okay, here we go. I'm going to take my dough. I'm going to make 2 loaves out of this. And I'll knead this a bit. And go ahead and cut this in half. And I'm just going to make these long hot dogs. I'm going to roll them out. Just roll them out into long hot dogs. Long shapes like a sausage. And one thing that I found that really helps is throwing my dough. Really gets the air out. There we go. There's one shape that we're looking for. And I'll go ahead and grease my pan. Let me get my oil. I'll use an olive oil. Put some of that on my pan. And that looks good. Okay. Oh, great. There's one of my loaves. Really simple. Same thing with the other. I'll just roll it out. Roll out the dough like a hot dog, and then smack it on the counter to get the air out. Roll it out some more. That's it. And if I make a nice shape, it'll end up looking nice when I'm through. Grease my pan again. Okay. Great. And that's it. I'll roll that around in the pan to coat all the sides. I'll put my traditional slits, my slashes. I'm going to make deep slashes. And that's it. Those are ready to go. We'll just set these aside and let them go for rising. Now I'm going to make my braided loaf. And this is really fun. I'll go ahead and pull my dough out of the pan, and that's it. Done with my pan. And I'll just knead this for minute here, just something I can cut up. I'm going to cut this into 3 equal pieces. Okay, there's 1, 2, 3. Here we go. And I'm going to, again, roll out 3 long strips of dough like hot dogs. Same as with my French or Italian bread. Same thing if I was making dinner rolls. Smack those on the counter a bit. Real simple. And there's 1. Looks good. Just roll these out into long, thin strips. Okay. All I want is 3 long, thin strips. And I'll roll this out. Again, smack it. Roll these out longer. Okay, here we go. Great. 3 long strips of dough. Now we're going to braid these, and this is the fun part. This is like doing boondoggle in day camp. This is not difficult. Take the center one and fold it over, and then one under. Over and under. That's how we start. Then we fold to the middle. Take the outside and fold to the middle. Take the odd man and fold to the middle. That's it. Really simple. Okay, I'll go ahead and let's do that again. Here we go. Take the center, fold over, and then under. Over and then under. That's how we start. Then it's just a matter of folding to the middle. Fold to the middle. You know, I'll make these a bit tighter. I'll take this and stretch this a bit and make it tighter. I'll stretch each one. But fold to the middle, fold to the middle, fold to the middle. Really, really straightforward. It's not difficult. I got it on my 2nd attempt. Just give it a try. If it doesn't work, unwind it and start over. Really straightforward. I placed my loaf on a greased pan and I covered the top with a little oil to make sure again that the skin didn't dry out, and put on some poppy seeds. Nice little touch. And I'm going to go ahead and let this just go for its first rising. Okay, now we're going to make some buns and rolls, just a variety of different things. Take my dough from my machine, and again I'm done with the machine. And I'll just knead this for a second. That's good. Make it into a ball. And I'm just going to cut this in a whole bunch of pieces. And I'll start by cutting it in half. Cut that in half again. And cut each of those in half again. And we'll make some hamburger buns, some hot dog buns, just a variety of things. I'll make some pieces, maybe those can be hoagie buns. I have just a cookie sheet. You can use anything. I could be using a glass baking dish. Anything you have, doesn't matter. Okay, now I'll just roll these out into cylinders again. Whether I'm making a hot dog bun or a hamburger bun, I'll just roll these into cylinders. Each one. And let me cut these in half again. Okay, we'll just make a bunch of things with our dough. I'll roll them into cylinders. Okay, that's good enough. Just rough roll these into cylinders. Again, to get the air out, I can bang my dough on the counter. And that actually gets some of the air out. Okay, great. Now, what I'm going to do is roll these into different shapes. Okay, I'll take one of my shapes and put it into a circle, fold it underneath. Same thing, fold underneath. Put it into a circle and just fold it. Really straightforward. Those are some hamburger buns. Now, these will end up being dinner rolls or hamburger buns, whatever. Just some of the shapes that you can make. And the long cylinders, we'll try and make them as neat as we can, and we'll think of those as hoagie rolls or hot dog buns. Some of these look pretty big. They'll end up being hoagie rolls. Okay, and really it's just that simple. We just take some dough, and when it rises, it'll get big and full, and we'll end up with hot dog and hamburger, dinner rolls, hoagie rolls out of this batch. Again, I'll coat the top of these with some oil. Make sure the skin doesn't dry out, no big deal. And then what we're going to do is we'll put some seeds on these. We can use any type of seeds. I've seen rolls that have coarse salt and caraway seeds. That's a nice touch. We'll put a few caraway seeds on these. We also have sesame seeds. We can make some sesame seed rolls. Okay, another thing we can do is we can put on, whoop, those were poppy seeds, excuse me. We'll put on some, here's sesame seeds. We can make our own sesame seed buns. Same thing we might put along the edge of a pizza. Now we'll make a freeform loaf. And I'll take my dough from my container, again done with a pan, and I'll knead briefly. And just knead this into a ball. I like to knead a freeform loaf a bit to really stiffen it up, because I want this to rise up in the air versus spreading out. In fact, there's an optimum time in baking a freeform loaf, and I'll give you an example of that. Okay, that's good. So we're just going to make it into a ball, and that's it. Put this in I've got grease in my pan, grease it a bit, cover the top. I'll make some slashes, some deep slashes, really deep slashes in the bread. And okay, that's set. Deep slashes. In fact, I'll go ahead and put some poppy seeds on this since we're using some seeds. Great, that looks good. Now, some of the tricks with, like I say, there's an optimum time in baking a freeform loaf. I'll show you an example. Here's a freeform loaf that I let go too long. If you let it go too long, it'll get big, it'll spread out wide. But it won't go high, basically. When the loaf starts now, the longer you let it go, it'll get wide, it'll flatten out. There's an optimum time in baking. I try and bake these pretty quickly. I watch it. As soon as it looks big, pop in the oven. If it looks like it's getting big and starting to fall out and get wide, I've really missed the boat. It still tastes good. But see, this is not a tall loaf, it's a wide loaf. Here's another one that came out more round, and that's what we're looking for. The rounder the better. Notice how deep the slashes are. That makes for a really nice, gnarly looking loaf of bread. Really deep slashes. And again, this loaf has no height to it. I let it go too long. It just spread out on the pan. It lost its ability to hold its form and rise up in the air. Everything at 375 degrees for 30 minutes. Everything's baked and everything turned out great. Some of our issues, now we've used seeds. We've used caraway seeds, sesame seeds, and poppy seeds. Another thing we could do is put cornmeal down on the bottom of our pan below our dough. We could put cornmeal on the bottom, then put our dough down. That's a nice trick. You'll see that on pizzas, also on French bread. Some of the other ways to treat the crust are brushing it with things. I have here an egg wash, which is either an egg and some water just mixed up with a fork, or an egg white and some water, or an egg yolk and some water, any combination of egg that you want, and you paint this on your bread. Now when you apply, this will be in the last 5 minutes of baking. I let the bread take its shape, its form, before I apply the egg wash. Another wash is a cornstarch and water combination, and this is the same thing. We put this on, we brush it on with a food brush in the last few minutes of baking. Some other things we can do, here's a couple of pans. This is a French bread or a baguette pan, it's just smaller. Then this pan is perforated, it has holes in it. You'll see pizza pans like this. The function of this is to let heat escape from the bottom. Not to let the heat in from the bottom, but really to let the heat, the moist, hot air from inside the bread come out in the bottom. It gives you a different effect on the crust. They're really nice pans. Some other things we can use. We can see that our Italian bread turned out great. Look at that. That is a beautiful loaf of Italian bread. Look at how big our freeform loaf got. And we'll compare that with the one that didn't rise. And the reason this got so big is because I baked again at the optimum time. In fact, I let this go through only a first rising of about 20 minutes and then a second rising of only 30 minutes. I baked this really fast. I got it into the oven fast while the yeast was still active, while it was still going up before it started to go out, basically. So that worked out nicely. Here's some baguettes, some French bread that I made in the French bread pans. Remember also I spray. Another trick is to every few minutes spray in the oven, just mist the top of the bread, makes a nice effect in the crust. Then a trick also with French bread. What I do is I take a cast iron skillet. When I preheat my oven, I put the skillet in the oven, let it get hot also. Then, let's say a minute before I'm going to bake, I put in a couple of cups, just pour into the skillet in the oven a couple of cups of hot water. And then that makes steam in the oven. And I have that in the bottom shelf of my oven, the bottom rack of my oven, with the bread then above it. And this simulates cooking French bread. In a commercial bakery, they inject steam into the oven, and that's how you get the real crispy crust that you're used to in French and Italian breads. That's really hard to get at home, but that's a nice trick. You can give that a try. Looks good. This is some really great looking bread. Look at this. Look at this Italian loaf. That's beautiful. Beautiful loaf. We could have put cornmeal on the bottom of that. Our freeform loaf is beautiful. It's really big. Big, beautiful loaf. Rose perfectly. Our braided bread, great. This will break off into nice like dinner rolls. Fun. We've got hot dog buns. Can't beat that. You can make all this at home. Everything really simple. In your oven, no big deal. Give it a try. In this segment of the video, we're going to make sourdough bread. Sourdough has been around for thousands of years BC. In fact, before you could go out to the grocery store and buy yeast, people used to keep yeast going. They'd keep it growing to leaven their bread. They needed some way to leaven their bread. It's been around forever, and it's easy. It's really simple. A lot of mystique and magic associated with sourdough. There does not need to be. I'm going to show you a simple starter. There are many starters that you can make. This is a simple starter, and how to make a loaf of sourdough in your bread baking machine. Any of the loaves that we've made up to now in our bread baking machine, we could have just as easily made them sourdough loaves by adding a cup of starter to our batch and adjusting our recipe a bit. Let's go ahead and begin by going to our list of ingredients for our sourdough starter. Topping my list is 2 tablespoons of active dry yeast. That's the yeast that I soak. 1/2 cup of water at 110 degrees, 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 2 cups of milk, 3/4 of a cup of sugar, and 1 tablespoon of vinegar. Let's make our starter. First of all, we can keep our starter in crockery. This is great, a nice crock. We can use glass. I use plastic. Plastic is fine, but no metal. Don't use metal. Okay, now in my container I put my water, my warm water at 110 degrees. Then I slowly sprinkle in my yeast to get each one of the granules wet and let the yeast sit and soak for 7 minutes. Remember, I'm using the active dry yeast. That's the point I'm at. Now I'm going to add my flour. Very simple, my 2 cups of flour and my 2 cups of milk. And then my 3/4 of a cup of sugar and my tablespoon of vinegar. And that's it for my starter. You can use any type of vinegar that you want. Okay, now I'm going to mix this, and I can only use a wooden spoon. Again, you can use a plastic spoon, but don't use any metal implements with your starter. And that's it. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to stir this, and I'm going to let my starter sit for 3 or 4 days before I can use it. This is a process. And anything that I keep it in, the lid has to cover not really tight. We don't want to seal this. That's done. And I have a plastic lid. I'll just cover it loosely, set on the lid. Now where I keep my starter, a nice warm place. what I do is right over the stove. Here's my starter. That's what we'll be using. We'll let this sit for a few days. And that's a nice warm spot because I have a light on my hood, my stove hood, and it keeps it warm in there, so that's perfect. Okay, now what I'm going to do is once a day I'll stir. With my wooden spoon, I'll go ahead and stir my starter. I can use it after 3 or 4 days, and every 5 days or so I'll feed the starter. That's how we keep the starter alive. To feed the starter, I'll put in a cup of water, a cup of flour, all-purpose flour, and a tablespoon of sugar. So every 5 days I feed my starter. Now, if I'm going to be using my starter, say twice a week, if I'm going to make bread twice a week, I can keep my starter up here. If not, if I'm not going to be using it that often, I need to keep it in the refrigerator, or it will spoil. I can also freeze some of my starter. I can take some of my starter and put it in a plastic bag and freeze it. It freezes really well. Okay, let's go ahead. Now we're ready. We're going to use this starter. We'll use a cup of this starter in our bread recipe. Let's go ahead and go to our recipe for our sourdough bread. Topping our list, we have 1 tablespoon of yeast, and we can use either yeast, the active dry yeast or the quick or the instant yeast. In this instance, I'm going to be using the active dry yeast. I'll be using 1 cup of water, a tablespoon of sugar, 1½ teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of oil, 1 cup of my starter, my sourdough starter, and between 3½ and 4½ cups of bread flour. Let's make some sourdough bread. Now, in this recipe, we're only using 1 cup of water. Normally, we use 1½ cups, and that's because our other half a cup of water is in our starter. We have 1 cup of starter, which is half water and half flour. So we are, in fact, using our 1½ cups of liquid. Let's start with our water. There's my cup of water at 110 degrees, and my tablespoon of yeast. Let that go for 7 minutes. That's time. That's been about 5 minutes. Our yeast is blooming, blossoming, growing. We'll go ahead and start the process. Turn on the machine and quickly add our sugar, our tablespoon of sugar, and our tablespoon of oil, and our salt, our 1½ teaspoons of salt. Great. Now we're going to let that mix and dissolve a bit. We want the sugar and the salt to melt basically, and at this point I'm going to add my starter. And I'm adding this in the front end of the process because we want it to mix in thoroughly and completely. So I'll let that go ahead and mix up. Now, if we were going to be using the other yeast, the quick yeast or the instant yeast, we'd add it about now after adding the starter. And that's it. We add the starter on the front end. That's really all I wanted to demonstrate. So I'll start adding my flour. There's 1 cup. 1 cup of my flour. I'll get the rest of my starter out of there. Now we could have done this with any one of our recipes. Great, and we'll add our 2nd cup of flour. Straightforward, and see how I speed the process by using my plastic spatula. I'm speeding the process by wetting everything. I'm really speeding the process up here. Real fast operation. I'll add my 3rd cup of flour. And we'll probably take another ½ cup of flour and then let the machine do its thing. And that looks good. That's it. I'll add 1/2 cup of flour. Great. Mix that in a bit. Good. That's it. We'll go ahead and come back at the end of the first rising. That's it for the first rising. I'll go ahead and take my dough from the machine and just remove it from my pan. There's my dough. Clean out my machine a bit, and again, I'm done with my machine. Great, and I'll just start kneading my dough. I'm going to make a free-form loaf. Now, I could make any one of the shapes, the long French or Italian bread shapes, anything in a bread pan, but I'm going to make a freeform loaf. So I'll just knead this a bit to stiffen it up and make it a ball, and then I'll just put it on my pre-greased pan. It's sticking to my hands a little, so you know what, I'll add a little more flour. It's a little tacky. Okay, here we go. I'm just going to knead this for a minute and make it into a nice ball. Great. Looks good. Okay, that's all set to go. There's my ball of dough. And here's my pre-greased pan. This time I'm going to put a little cornmeal down on the bottom. I'll set on my loaf. Go ahead and coat the skin with some oil so that the skin again doesn't dry out. And I'll make my deep slashes. Deep slashes, deep gnarly slashes. We'll let this go for its second rising, then pop it in the oven. We're done with our second rising, and here we go into the oven. Preheated oven, again 375 degrees for 30 minutes. It's time, out of the oven. Oh boy, another beautiful loaf. Ooh. Beautiful sourdough bread, not complicated at all. Any of the loaves that we've made in this video, we could make them sourdough loaves by substituting 1 cup of sourdough starter for a half a cup of our flour and a half a cup of our water. So reduce the recipes by a half a cup of flour and a half a cup of water. Replace that with the sourdough starter, and there you go. Beautiful. Made it yourself, and it's really not complicated. Try it at home. Don't those look delicious? Now with your starter, remember to stir it every day. If you don't use it twice a week, then you'll need to keep it in the refrigerator. It will spoil, and you need to feed your starter about every 5 days. Take a couple of cups of your starter out, give it away or use it, throw it away, but take it out and replace that with a cup of water, a cup of all-purpose flour, remember, and a tablespoon of sugar. And remember, always stir with a wooden spoon or a plastic spoon. Enjoy! In this segment of the video, we're going to make soft pretzels. Soft pretzels are fun, easy to make, great family fun, and just one of the many really neat things that we can do with our bread baking machine. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll go right to our list of ingredients for our soft pretzels. Topping my list, I have 1 tablespoon of yeast, and again that can be either an active dry or a quick yeast, either type. I'll be using 1½ cups of water, 1½ tablespoons of sugar, a teaspoon of salt, 3 tablespoons of butter or margarine, and 4+ cups of flour, and we'll be using an all-purpose flour. Then, like a bagel, after these have risen a bit, I'm going to drop them in boiling water. I'll be using 6 cups of boiling water and some baking soda. At the end, I'll be using an egg wash. An egg wash is an egg, some water, just mixed up with a fork, and I'll paint that on. Then sprinkle on some coarse salt. Let's make some pretzels. We'll remove our dough from our machine. Done with the machine. Great. Now I'm going to make 16 pretzels, so I'll go ahead and cut my dough into 16 pieces. I'll cut it in half and then in half again. And now I have it in 4 pieces. I'll cut each one of these in 4 pieces. And we'll end up with 16 pieces of dough. And what we're going to do is we're going to roll these out into long, thin strips like straws or like pencils. And then we'll tie them. We'll tie them and make them into pretzels. And that's something it's really easy to do, and I'll show you that close up. No big deal whatsoever. We'll just do it. Okay, here's my 16 pieces of dough, and I'm all set to go. Just set my dough up here, And I'll start rolling some of these out. Really straightforward. Take my dough and roll it into a long strip. I can throw my dough. Long strip, about 18 inches, just long and thin, like a pencil or a straw. Long and thin. Whoop, broke apart there. Okay, really, okay, good. A long thin strip. Now I'm going to loop it. I cross again, and fold over. And that's a pretzel. It's just that simple. And we'll go ahead and put these on a greased cookie sheet, any greased pan. We can use glass, baking dish, whatever. But that's all set. And again, long thin strips. Long thin strips. I'll roll this out and then fold it. Cross once, cross again, and fold over. And there's a pretzel. Put that onto my cookie sheet. Okay, here we go. Long thin strips. Really straightforward. Long and thin. Roll this out a good 18 inches. Long and thin, long and thin. And then cross it once, cross it twice, fold over. That's it. And onto my cookie sheet for its rising. Now we're going to go ahead and let these rise for about 20 minutes. In the meantime, I'll preheat my oven to 475 degrees, and I have my water on the stove. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the water, bring that to a boil. And what we're going to do is we're going to put our pretzels in the boiling water. We'll add some baking soda to the water before we bake them. After they rise for a bit, we'll put them in water. Same thing you do with a bagel. Okay, let's do one in slow motion. Okay, here I have a U. In slow motion, we're going to cross one time. Then we'll cross again. Fold over. And that's it. That's our pretzel. Sometimes I'll spray these with butter a bit. Spray them with an oil. That's a nice touch. Okay, we're through their rising. It's been about 20 minutes. I have my water ready on the stove. It's boiling. My oven's preheated to 475 degrees, and I'm going to go ahead and add my 2 tablespoons of baking soda to my water. And that's all set. We're ready to start putting our pretzels in the water, and we're going to just let them boil in the water for about 60 seconds. I'll just place in my pretzel, and I'm going to let this go for about 60 seconds. I usually put 3 in at a time. And from here, I'll put them right on my greased cookie sheet. They'll go right into the oven from here. But 60 seconds. Really simple, simple, simple. I won't bother flipping them at all. Get rid of that piece of crud without burning my fingers. 60 seconds. And you see they're swelling up, and that's what we want. And this is a thing that came with my wok. It's for making Chinese food. This is nice. That's it. Real simple. Really simple. Now what we're going to do with the ones that are done, we're going to coat them with our egg mixture. And this is an egg that I mix with some water, heat up with a fork, and I'm just going to paint the top of my pretzels with a brush. Really straightforward, no big deal. This is what's going to brown them in the oven. And this tray is all ready to go. At this point, we're going to put on our coarse salt, and watch how much salt you put on, because you don't need much. I don't put much salt on. You can always add more later. Great. And now I'm going to go ahead and bake these for about 10 or 15 minutes, 20. Just keep watching them until they get good and golden brown. In the last 5 minutes, I'll coat them again with my egg mixture if I want them really brown. Great. That's at 475 degrees. Time to remove my last batch from the oven. Here we go. Oh boy, they look good. Oh boy. Nice hot pretzels, they're great. Pretzels are one of the neat things that you can make with your bread baking machine. It's a nice project at home for kids. They're great. No cost in these. They're delicious. In fact, I made a whole batch here, and I can put these in a plastic bag. I can freeze half of these. They're just great. You can put on as much or as little salt as you want. Just a lot of fun. Go ahead and try it at home. Don't these look great? Just another neat project that we can do at home. They're fun, inexpensive, no cost in these at all. Great family fun. Enjoy! In this segment of the video, we'll be talking about the machine itself and some of the options available to us. Bread baking machines are great. They've been around for about 10 years, and as we've seen in the video, we can do just a whole bunch of things. We can make anything with our bread baking machine, but we have other options. Mixing machines have been around for years, and they're really great. This is an antique mixing machine, and it's nice also. I recommend the bread baking machine. What to look for, I look for a 1.5 pound machine that makes a 1.5 pound loaf. And that's versus a 2-pound machine. And that's because that's the amount of dough that goes in a bread pan, in a standard bread pan. So look for a 1.5 pound machine. What we're looking for now is we're looking for the quality of the machine and the power. So I'm looking the quality. If I buy these people's stereo or their television, I'll buy their bread baking machine. A name brand. I stick with a name brand. Also, I look at the watts and the amps, the power, because it's this motor in here that's going to, the bigger the motor, the more longevity you have, the more circuitry. You want, the guts of the machine is the power of it, the watts and the amps. So look at the readings, compare machines, and look for one with a, high watts, high amps, a powerful motor. That's great. These machines are just fabulous. I say there's no cleanup. I haven't really pointed that out in the video, but after I make bread, I don't clean out my machine. This is Teflon coated. I'll wait 2 or 3 days. The next time I make bread, all I need to do is rub my hand through the inside. It cleans everything out. Dump it in the sink or the garbage, and it's ready to go. Okay, our machines are really nice, and we've done a lot of things with our machine, but we have other options. Set this aside. Now, this is a mixing machine, and these have been around forever. It has multiple speeds, comes with a variety of hooks. These are really nice. What we do with a mixing machine, we use active dry yeast. First, we put our warm water at 110 degrees in the bowl. Then we put in our yeast and let that soak for 7 minutes. Then add our sweetener, our salt, and our oil. Turn on the machine, let it start mixing it a bit, and then slowly start adding our flour. The nice thing about these machines is that the kneading process, the mixing process takes a couple of minutes, maybe 2 minutes, and everything is mixed in properly. Then the kneading only takes another 2 or 3 minutes. So we have a batch of dough, the same amount. This machine makes the same amount of dough as a bread baking machine, but the whole process takes 5 minutes. We're ready for our first rising in 5 minutes, so that's nice. We could push a lot of dough. We could make a lot of bread with one of these machines. They're really nice. Now on the downside, they're really heavy, really heavy. A lot of cleanup. You have to, there's a lot of cleanup with one of these machines, cleaning off the hook, cleaning out the bowl. Also, they're very pricey. This machine costs about $300, and that's compared with a bread baking machine that may be, between $60 and $100. So there's a big difference. These are really nice. They've been around forever. They have a really big, powerful motor. Really nice machines, very well built. Then something that's interesting also, this is an antique bread baking machine, and I picked this up in an antique shop in Oatman, Arizona, which is a little touristy town in Arizona that has donkeys in the street and gift shops, really neat place. But what this is, it's a steel milk pail with clamps. You hook clamps to the bottom of this and you clamp it down to your counter basically, and it has a big dough hook in it. It's just a steel milk pail with a dough hook. You can see the dough hook and the crank. It has a large crank. The throw of the crank, the radius is great. So it doesn't take a lot of force. It doesn't take a lot of effort to crank to knead your dough. And this is really neat. This says that it won a gold medal in an exposition, which is really neat. In fact, it says, Universal Bread Maker awarded gold medal, St. Louis Exposition 1904. Now, isn't that interesting? This thing has been around since 1904, and you know, of all our machines, the mixing machine or the bread baking machine, this makes the most dough. A bread baking machine or a kneading machine will basically handle 4 cups of flour at a time. You know, this will handle 12 cups of flour. And it doesn't take a lot of energy, like I say, because the throw is so great. The radius of the throw is so big, it's no big deal. It has a lid. Even stamped on the lid is interesting. The lid has stamped on it the instructions for making dough. It says, put in all liquids first, then flour. Turn for 3 minutes. We only need to turn for 3 minutes. Similar to our mixing machine, and let rise in the pail. After rising, turn dough until dough forms a ball. Then take out the cross piece and then take out your dough basically. Isn't that interesting? And when I use this machine, what I do is I'll put in my water. Then at 110 degrees, again I'll put in my yeast, soak my yeast, let it sit for 7 minutes. Then put in my sweetener, my oil, my salt. Mix that, crank it a bit, stir it up. In fact, I'll even mix it with a wooden spoon before I put the crank in. And then I start adding my flour and just mixing, and just like the mixing machine or the bread baking machine, it forms a ball, and it's just great. Just a really neat thing. It's been around since 1904. See, bread baking has been around for thousands of years. People have been leavening their bread, making bread that rises for thousands of years. It's just fun. A fun thing to do. If you ever see one of these, they're great. Well worth the money. Another thing that's been out since the bread baking machines have been out, really a lot of fun. I have one right here. This is a pasta machine. Now, if you're going to be getting into bread baking and you have a lot of flour around, the pasta machines are really neat. Basically, this is an extrusion machine. We put our dough in. It's fast operation. In less than 5 minutes, we can have fresh pasta. Comes with a variety of dyes, and the dye makes a different shape. Basically, we put our ingredients in, turn on the machine, it mixes it up and makes a dough. And then it pushes the dough through a die. And that's how we make our pasta. These have been around for a while, a few years. They're really nice. If you're going to get into bread baking and you have a lot of flour around, it's a neat thing to consider. They're a lot of fun. Just, you know, one of the many things that we can do. So to sum things up a bit, we have our mixing machine, we have our antique mixing machine, and again we have our trusty bread baking machine. I'd highly recommend the bread baking machine just for the money. It's just the only way to go, and no cleanup, fast. We can make anything. Get one. If you don't have one, get one. They're a lot of fun. Again, I'd highly recommend a bread baking machine. They're a great investment, really good for the money, very cost effective, and all the things that we can make our own fresh breads. We can fortify them, make them really nutritious. Great family fun, really good investment, and I'd highly recommend it. Enjoy. Time to close things out. I've really enjoyed making the video. Have had a lot of fun. Bread baking, as you can probably tell, is a big thing with me. I really get into it. I really enjoy it. I've been teaching people how to bake bread for quite a while, and it's just fun. It's my hobby. Great fun, great fun. Some of the things that we'll talk about here at cost and source. To find some of these ingredients, you have a lot of options. In fact, I buy things in quantity. If you're so inclined, I buy 50-pound bags of flour, 50-pound bags of bread flour, 50-pound bags of stone ground whole wheat flour, 50-pound bags of rye flour. There's all sorts of things that you can get. You can get, as an example with rye, you can get a rye meal, you can get a light rye, a dark rye, a medium rye. All sorts of things are available to you. But where I get these is from a food broker or a food distributor. Now you can buy from these people, as an example, my caraway seeds. Caraway seeds are really expensive. I buy them in quantity from a food broker or a food distributor for about 1/20th the price, just a fraction of the price. And how you find these people in your area, if you're living in a city or in a rural area, get the yellow pages from the closest city, the largest place that you're near. Look in the yellow pages under food brokers, wholesalers, and distributors. And then call some of these places and find out. Ask them if they have bread flour. Do they have 50-pound bags of bread flour? Some of the names, the brand names are Cryl, Chiral, Full Power, Power Flour. It's just a bread flour, a high gluten bread flour. If they don't have 50-pound bags of bread flour, ask who in the area does. Someone does, because they're supplying caterers, restaurants, donut shops, hotels, and grocery stores. You know, it is out there. You just have to find it. When you find these people, ask for a line card, ask for a listing of what other things they carry. When you start dealing with them, you might want to buy other things like chocolate chips, you know, something in quantity that you buy. You might find that you'll buy some other items from them. Now, they're used to dealing with businesses. You can deal with them. They will be happy for the business. But when you call, you can place your order. Say, order a 50-pound bag of bread flour, just one bag. They'll ask who you are and just, you know, give your name, whatever. Tell them you're a caterer. It really doesn't matter. They're glad to sell to you. If it sounds like they're asking you a lot of questions, they just want to know who you are and whether or not you have an account for them, any real business down the road. But they're used to selling to people who make wedding cakes, who buy one bag at a time. I'll buy 1 or 2 bags at a time. It's no big deal. But what you do is you call up in advance, you order your goods and put them on what is called in business, it's called will call. And that means you will call. You will show up at their door. You'll show up. You'll drive to the place. You order it first. Give them a few hours to get the order ready. And then drive up, go to the office, go in, say who you are, and pay them cash. Not a check. Pay them cash. They'll give you a receipt. You go out to the loading dock and they'll have your goods for you. Your 50-pound bag of flour. And that's it's good to find the food brokers, wholesalers, and distributors if you're so inclined, and you can take the quantities. Now, one issue with buying things in quantity is flour over time will get bugs. There's really nothing you can do about it. I've tried, living in different areas of the country, I've tried putting my flour in sealed plastic containers, and it doesn't matter. I found that the bugs, the eggs basically, are in the flour. And sooner or later they're going to come out, they're going to grow. And I found a lot of times it's related to where the flour comes from. Sometimes flour that comes, when I lived in Texas I had the problem. I lived up in north in Seattle or in Buffalo, I didn't have the problem. So it's almost like some places, like areas that have roaches. If you're in a southern area that has a lot of bug problems, odds are you're going to get bugs in your flour. If you're in a northern place up like Canada, you may never have a bug in your flour, no matter how long you keep it. So that's one of the issues with buying in quantity. Now, just to sum up a bit, we've really beat to death yeast. You really need to have an understanding of what the yeast is all about, how it works. And remember, it's simple. Our active dry yeast is the yeast that we soak. It's the yeast that's been around forever. We soak it in warm water, 110 degrees for 7 minutes. And if there's any question, read on the bag, because there's different names for this yeast. One of the manufacturers calls their yeast, instant active dry yeast. Now, isn't that confusing? Is it an active dry yeast that you soak, or is it an instant yeast that you don't soak? Well, read on the bag. That happens to be the yeast that you don't soak. If you're confused at all by what yeast you have, whether you soak it or whether you don't soak it, just read on the bag to be sure. Another trick with yeast I show in the video, the proofing of the yeast, the foam test. You know, we put the yeast in the bowl, I put the camera over the bowl, and I wait for the bubbling, the blooming, the blossoming, the growing. And you know what? That's great. But if you get a batch of yeast, if you get a 2-pound batch of yeast and you don't get the foaming, you know what? It's probably still good yeast. I've contacted the yeast companies. They're really good people. They produce a really quality product, and we're lucky to be able to buy such high quality yeast today. If the yeast doesn't foam, odds are there's nothing wrong with it. It still works. Okay, the foaming, sometimes it foams for other reasons. Some batches foam, some batches don't foam. I've had a problem with that, but the yeast still works. I call them, talk to the yeast companies about it. It's a non-issue. Pretty much today, if you read the expiration date on the package and it's not expired, it's not too old, and the bag isn't punctured in any way, it's good yeast. In handling your yeast, keep it cold, keep it sealed, keep the air out. Air will deteriorate the yeast. If you let your yeast sit out, the bag's open, it's on the counter for a couple hours, it's losing its life. You're taking away some of the life of the yeast. Get your yeast in and out of the refrigerator fast. In fact, like I say in the video, I keep mine in the freezer. So yeast, you know, understanding yeast is very important. Remember, with our quick yeast or our instant yeast, the yeast that we don't soak, we basically mix it in within the batch. Once the machine gets going, we'll put in our water, we'll put in our sugar, our salt, our oil, mix that up a bit, add a cup of flour, then add our yeast. And that works just fine. But again, I've been using the active dry yeast, the yeast that you soak. 110 degrees for 7 minutes for so long. I prefer that. I find that I get the best results with that type of yeast. Now, for making different breads, for fortifying our breads, we can add anything. You know, I found 38 cents a pound for wheat bran. We can get wheat germ, oat bran, all sorts of oats, cornmeal, all sorts of different grains. We can make multi-grain breads. You can get little grinders and grind your own grains, a coarse grain to put in your bread. A lot of things you can do. Now, when I buy things to add to my breads, I always start at the grocery store. Before I go to a specialty food shop or a health food store, I'll get what I can at a grocery store. And I live in a city, I live in Las Vegas, and I'm really, you know, I'm always surprised of just what I can get at the grocery store in bulk and for not a lot of money. It's a lot cheaper, it's a lot less expensive if you can find it at a grocery store. So look there first before you go to any specialty shops. As you can probably imagine, I could go on and on about bread baking. It's just my thing. I really get into it. I've really enjoyed making the video. I hope that you've enjoyed the video and that you'll use the video, get a lot of use out of it. Teach someone else. It's something that you can pass on. Bread baking is a generational thing. It's something that we just don't know how to do anymore. Our parents or our grandparents made bread for the family, and we forgot. We don't know how anymore. I promote bread baking. I want to see people making bread today. Enjoy. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Goodbye from Video Bread.